Imagine waking up one morning to realize that every hardship you've faced, every pain, every struggle in your life, originates from a single horrifying truth, a truth that wasn't your choice to make. It's a haunting realization that the trembling hands that can no longer hold steady, the breath that labors to fill your lungs, the moments of confusion and the pain that has marred your existence, all trace back to decisions made before you were born. This wasn't a disease that slowly crept into your life. It was a fate inherited, a curse you never asked for but were forced to bear. The knowledge that your mother is not just your mother, but your cousin. That your father, too, is not a stranger but a direct relative, a member of the very family line that has shackled you with genetic baggage. The realization settles in that your family tree isn't a branching symbol of growth, but a twisted vine, looping tighter with each generation, choking on its own incestuous coils. You are not the result of love. You are the product of power. A breeding program, carefully constructed by your ancestors in a desperate attempt to preserve their wealth and influence, regardless of the human cost. This isn't fiction. This is reality for countless women throughout history, caught in the silent web of genetic fate, woven by their ancestors' ambitions and their need for political and familial purity. Before we delve deeper into the forgotten stories of these women, their survival, and their suffering, it's important to understand the twisted logic behind their torment. The obsession with purity and royal bloodlines wasn't born out of a mere desire for exclusivity. It was a belief that the royal blood running through their veins wasn't just different from that of commoners, it was sacred, purified by divine design, untouchable by the mingling of lesser blood. This belief wasn't just confined to a single dynasty. Across Europe, royal families subscribed to the dangerous myth that keeping the bloodline pure would preserve their divine right to rule, solidify their claims to power, and ensure their dominion over the masses. By the 16th century, this mindset had permeated the European aristocracy, intertwining royal families in an endless network of cousins marrying cousins, uncles wedded to nieces, and siblings giving birth to children who would one day govern empires. What these royal families failed to understand, what they could never have foreseen, was that this relentless pursuit of purity would lead to a genetic catastrophe, one whose echoes would reverberate across generations. They thought they were preserving their power, but instead they were sowing the seeds of destruction. The Habsburg dynasty, that infamous European powerhouse, perfected this toxic art of inbreeding. Their family motto could have easily been "Let others wage wars. You happy Habsburg marry," but these marriages were anything but joyous. They were calculated disasters, executed in the name of dynastic preservation, and they birthed some of history's most tragic figures, victims of a cruel, unforgiving system that valued bloodlines over human life. Our journey begins here, in Vienna, 1634, in the shadowed corridors of the Hofburg Palace. It is in this very place that Maria Anna of Austria is born, cursed before her first breath. Her story is just one example of the many lives irreparably altered by the obsessions of her family. She will never know a day without pain. Her body is marked not just by physical deformities, but by the undeniable truth of her ancestry. Maria Anna is the product of generations of cousins marrying cousins, a family tree so convoluted that it might as well have been a noose, its loops tightening with every generation. From the moment Maria Anna can remember, she knows she is different. While other children run and play, she struggles to walk. Her spine, curving unnaturally, forces her into a hunch that makes even breathing difficult. Her jaw protrudes in such a way that eating becomes a laborious task. Servants are required to cut her food into tiny pieces, and even then, every bite feels like a battle. Meals are not moments of nourishment, but of exhaustion, caution, and pain. As Maria Anna grows older, she doesn't just feel different, she begins to understand why. Her body mirrors the deformities of her ancestors, those haunting portraits she sees adorning the walls of the palace. Here, an uncle with the same jaw. There, a grandmother with the same twisted spine. The horror sets in as she realizes with cruel clarity that she is not unique. She is not an isolated case. She is the latest in a long, tragic line of victims who have been cursed by the choices of the generations before her. But it's not just her body that betrays her. It is the system, the very family she was born into, that has condemned her to a life of suffering. The palace physicians, the very men tasked with healing her, cannot provide answers. They offer no cures, only remedies that do little to alleviate her pain. They whisper about the Habsburg curse when they think she isn't listening, but never, ever do they speak the truth aloud. To her face, they speak of ailments beyond their understanding, of God's will, but they never acknowledge what they all know deep down, that her suffering is the inevitable consequence of her family's obsession with purity. Her world is a dark, lonely one. She spends her days locked away in dimly lit rooms, the curtains always drawn, hiding her from the world and the world from her. Yet, even in isolation, Maria Anna finds a way to escape. She immerses herself in books. Through her reading, she discovers worlds where bloodlines don't matter, where people marry for love, not for power, where children are born without the weight of their ancestors' decisions hanging over them. But reality is never far behind. Court physicians continue their examinations, treating Maria Anna not as a person but as a living, breathing case study. They measure her deformities with cold precision, cataloging her suffering for posterity, never once questioning the root cause of her condition. Maria Anna isn't a princess in their eyes. She is a specimen, a tragic example of what happens when genetics are twisted in the name of power. For centuries, royal families across Europe adhered to a belief so deeply ingrained that it seemed almost sacred. The purity of their bloodline was paramount. The blood that coursed through their veins was seen as a divine gift, a symbol of their right to rule. The concept of blue blood, literally different from that of the common masses, was rooted in the belief that their lineage was not only superior but also sacred, chosen by God to lead nations. To preserve that divine purity, they took extreme measures, and nothing, no matter how cruel or unnatural, was too much if it ensured the preservation of this power. At the heart of this belief lay the practice of royal inbreeding. The idea was simple. Marrying within the family ensured that no foreign blood could dilute the royal essence. This strategy, while it seemed logical from a political standpoint, had a tragic flaw: the belief that blood purity would safeguard the future of the family without realizing that it would instead weaken it over generations. A web of power and preservation that slowly entangled its own creators. By the time we reached the 16th century, the practice of inbreeding among European monarchies was already firmly entrenched, especially in the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family. These marriages, designed to strengthen political alliances and maintain control, created a tangled web of cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and siblings marrying one another, all with the intention of keeping royal bloodlines intact. The Habsburgs in particular became notorious for their obsessive commitment to maintaining power by keeping their bloodlines pure. The family's motto might as well have been, "Let others wage wars. You, happy Habsburgs, marry and marry." They did over and over again, often to close relatives, in the belief that by keeping the bloodline pure they would solidify their right to rule. However, the very practice that was intended to preserve their rule ultimately led to their downfall. The genetic cost of such repeated inbreeding was high. With each generation, harmful recessive genes, previously masked in less closely related families, came to the surface. What began as a royal dynasty with unmatched power slowly turned into a ticking time bomb of genetic defects, all hidden behind portraits of regal smiles and grand titles. As the years passed, the Habsburgs' relentless pursuit of power and blood purity began to take a devastating toll. Deformities, mental illnesses, and physical weakness became the hallmark of this royal family. The Habsburg jaw, a severe protrusion of the lower jaw, became the most infamous symbol of the genetic damage caused by generations of inbreeding. It was visible in nearly every royal portrait, a glaring reminder of the high price they paid for their obsession with purity. But the Habsburg family wasn't alone in their tragic pursuit. Other royal families too found themselves entangled in this web of genetic decline, especially in Spain, where the Catholic monarchy encouraged marriages between close relatives to maintain a unified, pure royal bloodline. This system not only created political stability but, tragically, genetic instability. The consequences of these practices were felt across generations. as families that sought to maintain their divine right to rule inadvertently set in motion a tragic chain of events. Diseases, deformities, mental health disorders, all of these became embedded within the very fabric of royal families. These women, daughters, wives, mothers, were caught in the middle of a system that valued bloodline purity over their own well-being. And in the case of the Habsburgs, they would pay the ultimate price for their ancestors' decisions. As we move through the centuries, we will meet women like Maria Anna of Austria, Joanna of Castile, and Margaret Theresa of Spain, who, despite their royal status, lived lives defined not by luxury or power, but by genetic deformity and social isolation. They were trapped in a cycle, unable to break free from the legacy of their family's decisions. And their stories offer a chilling glimpse into the human cost of a political obsession that valued power over humanity. The cruel irony of this practice is that while it was intended to preserve power, it ultimately shattered it. The very same bloodlines that had once ruled Europe's greatest empires became a symbol of the destructive consequences of inbreeding. And the women of these bloodlines, whose lives were shaped by the decisions of those who came before them, became the tragic figures whose suffering we remember today. The Habsburgs were not just a royal family, they were the very embodiment of the European aristocratic ideal. For centuries, their family tree was carefully cultivated, its branches intertwined and tightly bound, ensuring that power, wealth, and influence would remain firmly within the family. But as we peel back the layers of history, the branches of this tree reveal a darker, more tragic story, one of genetic decline and self-destruction. The Habsburg dynasty's commitment to preserving its bloodline was absolute. Every marriage, every union, was seen as a strategic move in a centuries-long game of power. The idea of marrying outside the family, particularly to those of common blood, was unthinkable. It was a practice that persisted for generations, with royal marriages arranged to consolidate power, form alliances, and keep the family's wealth intact. But with each generation, the cost of such inbreeding became clearer. What began as a powerful family, ruling vast swathes of Europe, slowly became a dynasty defined not by strength, but by the crippling consequences of its own genetic isolation. As the centuries passed, the Habsburg family grew more and more entangled in itself. By the time we reached the 16th century, the practice of marrying within the family was so entrenched that it became the norm, not the exception. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, and sometimes siblings even married one another, all in the name of preserving the royal bloodline. The Habsburgs believed that by keeping their blood pure, they could maintain divine favor and solidify their hold on power. But what they couldn't have known, or perhaps what they refused to acknowledge, was that the purity of their blood would become their greatest curse. The results of this inbreeding were immediate and devastating. The family began to suffer from a range of genetic disorders, many of which would become more pronounced with each passing generation. The most visible and infamous of these was the so-called Habsburg jaw, a grotesque protrusion of the lower jaw, which became a hallmark of the family. This deformity was not just a cosmetic flaw, it represented the physical manifestation of generations of inbreeding. But the consequences didn't stop there. Mental illnesses, developmental delays, and physical deformities began to plague the Habsburgs. Men and women who were once rulers of vast empires found themselves increasingly incapacitated by genetic defects. Some were physically weak, others mentally unstable, and many found themselves suffering from a range of illnesses that their physicians could neither diagnose nor treat. In fact, the Habsburgs' obsession with maintaining their bloodline purity became so extreme that they ignored the genetic dangers inherent in their practices, even when it became clear that these marriages were resulting in severe physical and mental health issues. The family continued to marry within their own ranks, convinced that they were preserving the purity of their lineage. This blind adherence to tradition and power ultimately created a genetic time bomb that would devastate the family for generations to come. The most tragic part of this story is that the women of the Habsburg family were caught in the center of it all. They were not just pawns in political games, they were victims of a system that saw them as breeding tools, designed to perpetuate the family line at all costs. They were married off to their cousins, uncles, and brothers in order to preserve the family's power. Their worth was measured not by their individuality but by their ability to bear heirs, and for those who failed to do so, the consequences were brutal. The women we will meet in this journey, from Maria Anna of Austria to Margaret Theresa of Spain, were not just royal figures. They were living examples of the destructive power of inbreeding, trapped in bodies and lives that had been shaped by decisions made long before they were born. Their suffering was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and deeply rooted in a system that valued power over humanity. In a sense, the Habsburg family was doomed from the very beginning. By the time the 17th century rolled around, the damage had already been done. The family tree, once a symbol of strength and dominance, had become a twisted, gnarled mess. The women of the Habsburg family were not just victims of their circumstances, they were symbols of a royal system that had become its own worst enemy. They were the embodiment of the price paid for centuries of political ambition and blind adherence to tradition. The story of the Habsburgs is one of great power and even greater tragedy. It is a story of a family that, in its pursuit of bloodline purity, created its own downfall. The consequences of their actions were felt not only by the Habsburgs themselves but by the entire European continent. As their inbred descendants struggled to maintain the power their ancestors had so carefully cultivated. But what does this say about the women who lived through it? What does it say about those like Maria Anna, Joanna of Castile, and Margaret Theresa, who were born into this cruel system, forced to live lives defined by suffering, isolation, and genetic catastrophe? Theirs is a story not just of royal lineage, but of human suffering on a scale that few could ever truly understand. Their lives were not theirs to control. They were born into a system that cared only for bloodline, for power, for the continuation of a dynasty. And in the end, it wasn't just the Habsburg family that paid the price, it was the women who were trapped in its web. In the shadowed corridors of Hofburg Palace, a child is born who will never know a life free from suffering. Maria Anna of Austria's story begins as one of tragedy, a victim of a royal legacy determined to preserve the family's divine right to rule, regardless of the cost. But her tale is not just one of physical suffering, it is a life defined by the legacy of her family's obsession with bloodline purity that would come to haunt her every day of her existence. Maria Anna entered the world in 1634, the latest in a long line of Habsburgs who had married within their family for centuries. Her birth was celebrated, of course, as all royal births were, but for Maria Anna, the celebration was short-lived the day she was born. So too was the fate that would define her entire existence. Her family tree was not a sprawling expanse of growth, but a twisted knot, each loop tighter than the last. With each generation, the effects of inbreeding had grown more apparent, more severe. From the very first days of her life, Maria Anna's physical deformities were unmistakable. Unlike other children who could run and play with ease, she struggled with every movement. Her spine curved in a painful arc, forcing her into a hunched posture that made breathing difficult. The deformity was not just a cosmetic flaw, it was a daily struggle. Simple tasks that most children took for granted, standing, walking, sitting up, were monumental challenges for her. As a result, Maria Anna often found herself confined to a world that was not built for someone like her. A world where every movement was an ordeal, where even the air she breathed seemed to weigh her down. Her jaw, too, was severely protruded, a characteristic that would become the hallmark of her family's genetic decline. Eating became a grueling process. Servants were forced to cut her food into small pieces, and even then, meals were a struggle, each bite becoming a test of endurance. The simple act of nourishing herself became an exhausting ordeal, something she dreaded every day. But physical suffering was just the beginning. Maria Anna's torment was compounded by the psychological weight of her condition. She was aware of her differences from a very young age, and as she grew, it became painfully clear to her that she was not like other children. Her deformities were not just a personal struggle, they were a constant reminder of the genetic chain that bound her to generations of suffering. She saw herself in the faces of her ancestors, her uncle with the same protruding jaw, her grandmother with the same twisted spine. It was as though every painted portrait in the palace was a cruel reflection of her own fate. As she grew older, Maria Anna became keenly aware of the full scope of her inheritance. The palace physicians, who were tasked with observing her condition, could offer little help. Their treatments ranged from bloodletting to strange prayers, but none could cure what was deeply embedded in her genes. It was the Habsburg curse that had been passed down for generations, a curse that was the inevitable consequence of the family's obsession with maintaining a pure bloodline. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Maria Anna's existence was the way she was viewed by those around her. To the physicians and courtiers, she was not a princess in need of care and compassion. She was a case study, a living example of what happens when genetics go wrong. They measured her deformities with cold detachment, making observations about the curve of her spine and the protrusion of her jaw, as if she were an object rather than a human being. Her suffering was documented, catalogued, and ultimately ignored. No one in the court, it seemed, was willing to confront the real cause of her condition, the inbreeding that had been perpetuated for centuries by her own family. Maria Anna spent most of her days hidden away from the world, her body a constant source of shame and isolation. The windows of her room were always closed, the curtains drawn to shield her from the eyes of the outside world. It wasn't just her deformities that kept her in the dark, it was the knowledge that her very existence was the product of a system that saw her not as a person, but as a vessel for power. She was the latest casualty in a long line of women who had been married off to preserve royal bloodlines, their value measured not by their worth as individuals, but by their ability to produce heirs. Despite the isolation, Maria Anna found solace in one thing: books. She immersed herself in literature, finding escape in stories where bloodlines didn't matter, where love could flourish outside the constraints of royal duty. But even in her intellectual freedom, the reality of her situation was never far behind. She was surrounded by portraits of ancestors whose faces bore the same marks of inbreeding that marred her own. Every page she turned, every word she read, reminded her of the inescapable truth. Her family's obsession with purity had doomed her to a life of suffering. And yet, Maria Anna's story is not one of total defeat. Her intellect, her sharp mind, was one of the few parts of her that remained unaffected by her physical deformities. Though she was often hidden away, her mind roamed freely, exploring worlds beyond the walls of the palace. She found refuge in knowledge, in understanding that her worth was not defined by her deformities. Even though the world around her continued to see her as a living testament to the consequences of royal inbreeding, but her life would not be marked by the triumph of intellect over physical pain. Maria Anna's existence was, in the end, defined by the tragic choices made by her ancestors, their pursuit of power at the cost of their own humanity. And at the age of 32, her body finally surrendered to the weight of the genetic damage that had been passed down to her through generations. She died young, her body ravaged by the inherited defects that were the inevitable result of her family's obsessive quest for bloodline purity. Her death certificate lists various ailments, but the true cause of her death is never written down. Maria Anna didn't die from a disease or an accident. She died because her ancestors chose power over humanity, purity over compassion. She was the tragic end of a family line that had allowed its obsession with bloodlines to overshadow the basic needs of its members. In the end, Maria Anna's life was not one of grandeur or glory, but of pain, isolation, and a slow surrender to a fate that she could not escape. Maria Anna's life was not only defined by her suffering, but also by the medical community's inability or unwillingness to address the true source of her pain. Her deformities were too pronounced, too stark, for anyone to ignore. Yet the physicians who attended to her were often too afraid or too bound by tradition to acknowledge what was plainly evident. Her condition was the result of generations of royal inbreeding. Instead of addressing the root cause of her suffering, the doctors and courtiers offered superficial explanations. The palace physicians, some of the best trained medical professionals of the time, performed their usual rounds, examining Maria Anna with cold clinical detachment. They measured the curve of her spine, the protrusion of her jaw, and the weakness in her limbs, but never questioned the underlying cause of her condition. They blamed God, they blamed the stars, but never once did they mention the truth that everyone knew deep down, that the Habsburg curse was not some divine punishment, but the direct result of centuries of inbreeding. Maria Anna's deformities were often referred to in hushed tones as the Habsburg curse. This was the whispered label given to the genetic deformities and illnesses that plagued many of the Habsburg family members. The term, while widely known, was never officially used in the court records. It was as if the name itself, Habsburg curse, held too much weight, too much shame, to be openly discussed, but it was inescapable. It was in the way her jaw hung too low, the way her spine bent unnaturally, and the way her limbs failed to grow strong. Despite the physician's clinical observations, Maria Anna's suffering was largely ignored. Instead of providing genuine care, the physicians focused on alleviating the most visible symptoms, performing bloodletting or prescribing herbal remedies, practices that were as ineffective as they were outdated. The idea of curing the curse through medicine never occurred to them. Instead, they focused on managing her condition with the limited tools at their disposal. In the midst of this, the physicians remained silent about what they all knew. They whispered among themselves when Maria Anna was not present. Behind closed doors, they discussed the family's problems that could not be fixed by medicine or prayers. The genetic flaws of the Habsburg family were too deeply ingrained to be ignored any longer. Yet, no one dared to say it aloud. They avoided discussing the real cause, perhaps because acknowledging it would have meant confronting the monstrous truth about the family's practices, their obsession with preserving a royal bloodline at all costs. Instead of confronting the painful reality, Maria Anna was treated as a case study, a tragic figure to be observed from a distance, but not truly helped. Her physicians documented her deformities, not out of concern for her well-being, but for the sake of future reference. They saw her as a medical curiosity, an example of what could go wrong when royal families pursued their obsession with blood purity. And Maria Anna, trapped in this dark world, was left to live out her days in isolation, treated as a specimen rather than a human being. It was not just her deformities that set Maria Anna apart from the world, it was the way her family treated her, as though she were a problem to be solved, not a person to be cared for. Her parents, who had brought her into the world to uphold their dynastic ambitions, could not offer her the love and compassion that she desperately needed. Her mother, the very person who should have been her protector, could not see past the family's obsession with bloodline preservation. In fact, her mother's role in her suffering was significant. The obsession with purity ran deep, and Maria Anna's mother, despite the emotional toll it took on her daughter, was complicit in this cruel system. She too had been raised in the same environment, one that valued bloodline over human life, tradition over compassion. And so, Maria Anna found herself trapped in a system where love and empathy were secondary to political needs. Her mother could not offer her the unconditional love that a child needed because she, too, was bound by the same royal expectations, the same obsession with blood purity. But even more tragic than the physician's detachment was the fact that Maria Anna could not escape her fate, even in the recesses of her mind. She learned to read voraciously, escaping into books that promised worlds where bloodlines didn't define a person's worth. In her books, she found solace. She discovered stories of people who loved and married for reasons that had nothing to do with royal blood or political power. These stories became a refuge for her, a place where she could imagine a life not defined by her deformities, a life not controlled by the constraints of royal expectations. But these were just fantasies. The harsh reality always intruded. Every time she gazed into the mirror or looked at a portrait of her ancestors, she saw the truth reflected back at her, the truth that her family, for all their power and grandeur, had doomed her to a life of pain and isolation. The Habsburg curse was not just a physical affliction, it was a societal one, a curse that condemned Maria Anna to a life where she was seen as nothing more than a tool in the royal bloodline, a living example of what happens when a family chooses power over humanity. Yet, despite everything, Maria Anna remained resilient. Her mind, sharp and curious, continued to seek out knowledge in the midst of her suffering. But the weight of her family's choices, the curse they had passed down to her, would never leave her. The darkness that shadowed her every step was not just a physical condition. It was a life defined by genetic legacy and political manipulation, one that would ultimately claim her at the age of 32. Maria Anna's death was not just the end of her life, it was the tragic end of a family line's attempt to preserve itself at the expense of its own humanity. Her death certificate listed the causes of her ailments, but the real cause, the one that could not be written down, was her family's decision to place power and bloodline purity above everything else. Maria Anna's life was defined by her physical limitations, but it was her emotional isolation that perhaps proved most destructive. Trapped within the walls of the Hofburg Palace, she was separated not just from the world but from the warmth of human connection. The isolation that became her daily reality was compounded by the knowledge that her deformities set her apart, not only from the people outside the palace, but even from those within her own family. Her deformities, once visible to anyone who looked upon her, were now entrenched in her own self-perception. She had spent her youth in the company of family portraits, her ancestors' faces staring down at her from the walls, each one a reflection of her own suffering. Her uncle's pronounced jaw, her grandmother's curved spine, these traits became her constant companions, not just in appearance but in the way she saw herself. She was not only trapped by her body, she was trapped in a family legacy that dictated her value was measured only by the purity of her blood, not by her humanity. But Maria Anna's mind was a different story. It was one part of her that remained untarnished by the curse of inbreeding. While her body betrayed her, her intellect remained sharp. She began to retreat further into the world of books, finding solace in the written word. In her private chambers, away from the clinical eyes of the physicians, Maria Anna lost herself in stories where bloodlines didn't define people's worth. In books, she found freedom, a world where love, choice, and personal worth were more important than familial duty and political ambition. In her readings, she discovered a stark contrast to her own life. The idea of marrying for love, rather than political necessity, was a foreign concept to Maria Anna, but one that provided her with a sense of refuge. She devoured stories where people were able to choose their own paths, to marry for reasons other than power. These worlds were her escape, a place where bloodlines and dynastic obligations didn't carry the crushing weight that they did in the real world. Yet, no matter how much she immersed herself in literature, the truth of her situation always loomed large. The physical limitations that defined her every day could never be escaped in the pages of a book. The pain of her deformities, the strain in every movement, was real and unrelenting. Every attempt to stand or walk reminded her of the curse that ran through her veins. Each day she was reminded of how much her family's obsession with maintaining royal bloodlines had cost her. It wasn't just her body that had been damaged, it was her entire future, a future that had been dictated long before she was born. The world outside the palace remained a distant dream for Maria Anna. She was never allowed to experience the joys of childhood. While other children played and ran, she was forced to remain within the confines of her chambers, shielded from the prying eyes of the court. In her solitude, Maria Anna yearned for human connection, but her deformities made it impossible for her to seek companionship. Potential suitors, also her cousins, recoiled in horror when they saw her condition. In the royal court, where every marriage was arranged for political gain, her deformities were simply too great to overlook. Marriage, something that was the expected destiny of every royal woman, was never a choice for Maria Anna. Even in a world where cousin marriage was not unusual, her physical condition made her unfit for such a union. Her family had raised her to understand that her value lay not in her ability to love or choose for herself, but in her role as a vessel for continuing the bloodline. And yet, for all her suffering, her family's expectations remained unchanged. Maria Anna's life was not her own. It was a tool in a much larger game of dynastic politics, and she had no power to change it. Her emotional suffering only deepened as the years went on. Her self-worth was constantly eroded by the demands placed upon her, by the cruel reminder that she was not seen as a person but as a political asset. The concept of love, a gift that others took for granted, was denied to her. She never experienced the joy of companionship, the connection of shared love, or the warmth of another person's care. Instead, she existed as a shadow in a palace full of grandeur and wealth, a palace that only highlighted her isolation. In these dark, quiet moments, Maria Anna would often retreat into herself. Her thoughts would wander to the imagined worlds in her books where people could live freely, where their value wasn't measured by their bloodline, but by their character and their actions. It was here, in her mind, that Maria Anna could escape the harsh realities of her life. In the pages of novels, in the characters she read about, she found freedom. She could escape into worlds where the things that defined her, her deformities, her isolation, her family's cruel ambitions didn't exist. But no matter how much she yearned for this freedom, reality would always intrude. The walls of the palace were never far, and the faces of her ancestors, each one bearing the marks of their own inbreeding, were constantly watching. Maria Anna could never truly escape the suffocating grip of the family legacy that had shaped her existence. It was this mental and emotional escape that gave her the strength to survive as long as she did. While her body betrayed her, and the world around her remained indifferent to her suffering, her mind offered her a brief reprieve. It was in her mind that she found the courage to endure, even as her body slowly deteriorated under the weight of her family's mistakes. But eventually, even the strength of her mind was not enough. By the time Maria Anna reached the age of 32, the damage done by generations of inbreeding became too much for her body to bear. The toll on her health was immense, and her life defined by physical pain, emotional isolation, and the burden of a family that valued blood over humanity came to an untimely end. Her death, though marked by several ailments, was ultimately the result of a family system that had long since turned its back on compassion in favor of political power. Maria Anna's story was not just one of personal suffering. It was a tragic testament to the lengths that royal families would go to preserve their bloodlines, no matter the human cost. Maria Anna's life, marked by genetic catastrophe and emotional isolation, was not just the consequence of her personal misfortune, was also the direct result of the political decisions made by her family, decisions that placed power and bloodline purity above all else. These choices were not made in a vacuum. They were a reflection of a broader royal tradition that saw marriages not as unions of love, but as tools for political stability, power consolidation, and dynastic continuity. The Habsburgs, like many royal families before and after them, viewed marriage as a strategic alliance, a transaction rather than a personal bond. The political motivations behind royal marriages were always clear. The bloodline must be preserved, no matter the cost. This obsession with blood purity was so ingrained in their royal identity that it became the foundation of their rule. Marriages were arranged not for love or even for mutual benefit, but to ensure that power remained within the family. And in doing so, they ignored the very human costs of these unions, costs that would come to haunt the Habsburgs for generations. Maria Anna's parents, like all members of the Habsburg dynasty, were not guided by the needs or well-being of their children, but by a relentless pursuit of political advantage. As children, they were seen as pawns in the larger game of dynastic survival, their marriages and their futures determined not by their individual desires or health, but by the political needs of their family and the preservation of royal blood. In Maria Anna's case, her parents were fully aware of the risks of their inbreeding practices, yet they chose to perpetuate them, perhaps out of fear of the loss of power or simply out of a misguided sense of duty. They were trapped in a cycle of political alliances that demanded their children marry within their family, perpetuating the same genetic flaws with each successive generation. The royal court was steeped in a toxic atmosphere of political maneuvering, where every marriage, every union, was scrutinized for its political advantage. Love, affection, and personal well-being were not considered. What mattered was the preservation of power, the continuation of the royal line. For the Habsburgs, their royal blood was sacred, and no cost, neither the physical suffering of their children nor the emotional toll on their lives, was too great to ensure its purity. This political system, which treated human beings as mere vessels for dynastic continuation, extended far beyond Maria Anna's own life. Her suffering was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger trend that defined the fate of many royal women. They were born into families that saw them not as individuals, but as objects to be used in the service of political agendas. The idea of marriage as an expression of love was anathema to this worldview. For these women, their value was defined solely by their ability to produce heirs and preserve the bloodline. Even as Maria Anna endured the pain of her deformities, she was also forced to live with the knowledge that her suffering had been designed by her ancestors' choices. The very blood that ran through her veins, the blood that had been so carefully guarded and passed down through generations, was the source of her physical agony. It was the tragic irony of her existence. She was the embodiment of the Habsburg family's obsession with purity, a family that had sacrificed its own children to maintain its power. But what made Maria Anna's situation even more tragic was the fact that her family's political decisions were not made out of malice or cruelty. They were made out of fear of losing their position, fear of weakness, and fear of the unknown. The Habsburgs were obsessed with the idea of divine right and royal supremacy, and they believed that by keeping their bloodline pure, they could maintain that supremacy forever. But in doing so, they condemned their own children to lives of suffering, lives marked by deformities and mental health issues that could have been avoided had they embraced the natural diversity of human genetics. Maria Anna was not the only woman to bear the brunt of this legacy. Other Habsburg women, such as Joanna of Castile and Margaret Theresa, suffered similar fates, their lives defined by the same political decisions that had trapped their family in a cycle of genetic decline. These women were not just victims of their circumstances. They were victims of a system that placed dynastic survival above their humanity. What is perhaps the most devastating aspect of this political system is how it dehumanized the women who were caught within it. They were not allowed to make their own choices, to live their lives on their own terms. Instead, they were defined by their ability to produce heirs, to marry for the benefit of the family, and to carry on the royal line. Their worth was never measured by their intellect, their desires, or their happiness, but by their ability to perpetuate the bloodline. Even in the face of physical suffering, emotional turmoil, and the loss of their individuality, the women of the Habsburg family had no agency. They were trapped within a system that saw them as nothing more than vessels for genetic material, their lives dictated by the demands of political power. And while their physical deformities and psychological struggles were evident to all, the true cause of their suffering was always obscured. The real tragedy was not just the deformities they bore, but the system that had created them and perpetuated them. Maria Anna's story, like the stories of so many royal women, is a testament to the cruelty of a system that valued bloodline purity above human welfare. It is a reminder that, in the pursuit of power and political advantage, humanity can be lost. Maria Anna was not a woman to be admired for her beauty, her strength, or her political acumen. She was a woman to be mourned for the simple fact that her life was never truly her own. Her suffering was the inevitable consequence of a family that placed dynastic survival above all else. And in the end, it was the family itself that would pay the price for its obsession with purity. As we move from the shadowed halls of Hofburg Palace to the grand courts of Spain, we encounter another tragic figure in the legacy of royal inbreeding, Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad or Juana la Loca in Spanish. Her story is both a cautionary tale and a heart-wrenching example of how political marriages carried out to preserve bloodlines can leave lasting scars on those caught in their web. Born in 1479 to the Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, Joanna was the product of a union between cousins to royal houses that, like many others in Europe, believed that maintaining their bloodlines pure was crucial to their rule. Isabella and Ferdinand were cousins, and their marriage was not an expression of love but a strategic alliance, one aimed at consolidating power and uniting Spain. And so, Joanna entered the world not as an individual with hopes and dreams of her own, but as a piece in a much larger game, a game where her worth was measured by her ability to secure Spain's future. At first glance, Joanna appeared to be a woman destined for greatness, intelligent, well-educated, and fluent in several languages. She was prepared to take her place as the Queen of Spain. Yet beneath this promising exterior, the seeds of her eventual downfall were already planted. Her parents, in their obsession with preserving royal purity and political power, had created a family system that would lead to unimaginable consequences. Joanna's first signs of distress came after her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy in 1496. This union, though politically significant, became a psychological battleground for Joanna. Philip, who was described as charming and handsome, was also cold and unfaithful, traits that would ignite Joanna's obsessive love for him. Her intense feelings, though natural for any woman in a tumultuous relationship, would soon be interpreted by the court as madness. But was it really madness, or was it the logical response of a woman trapped in a system that had stripped her of any personal autonomy? In a world where marriages were arranged for political gain, Joanna's union with Philip was not one of affection, but one of duty. And when that duty turned into a source of constant humiliation, with Philip's unfaithfulness playing out in public, her response was intense and emotional reaction that, in a more compassionate world, might have been seen as a natural human reaction to trauma. Instead, it was dismissed as madness, a diagnosis that would haunt her for the rest of her life. When Philip died unexpectedly in 1506, the tragedy of Joanna's life took a darker turn. Grief-stricken and unable to let go of her dead husband, she traveled across Spain, carrying his coffin with her, opening it regularly to kiss his decomposing body. This act, horrifying to many, was a desperate attempt by Joanna to hold on to the one person who had shown her affection, if that affection had been fleeting and cruel. It is in this moment that Joanna's reputation as Juana la Loca was cemented. But was it truly madness? Or was it the result of a woman's profound isolation and loss, exacerbated by the political system that had stripped her of any true connection to her own humanity? Joanna's political and personal misery worsened when her father, Ferdinand, and later her son Charles V, took advantage of her supposed madness. They locked her away in a convent, a move that allowed them to seize control of Spain and the empire without her interference. For 46 years, Joanna lived in confinement, her mental state deteriorating as she endured the isolation and neglect that defined her final years. The conditions in which she lived were horrendous. She was confined to dark, cold rooms, deprived of food and water, and kept in a state of isolation that only deepened her despair. Her attendants reported that she would often go for weeks without bathing, that she tore her clothes, and that she would scream for hours at a time. These behaviors, though extreme, can be understood as symptoms of severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, all of which were exacerbated by the physical and emotional abuse she suffered in the name of political convenience. Was Joanna truly mad, or was she the victim of a system that valued political power over human compassion? Modern historians increasingly argue that her madness was not inherent, but a convenient label used to strip her of agency and remove her from the throne. Her mental health issues, while tragic, were likely the result of a lifetime of trauma, compounded by decades of isolation and neglect. Joanna's so-called madness was a political tool, a justification for her removal from power, and a way for her family to maintain control over Spain without the inconvenience of a queen who could challenge their authority. The genetic component of Joanna's mental state cannot be ignored. As we have seen with the Habsburgs, inbreeding often led to mental health issues, depression, and anxiety disorders. Joanna's family tree shows clear patterns of mental illness, conditions that became more common and more severe with each generation of inbreeding. Her great-grandmother had similar episodes, and her daughter Catherine would later suffer from severe depression as well. This pattern of mental illness was, at least in part, a consequence of the family's insistence on marrying within their own bloodlines. The Habsburgs, in their pursuit of political power, created a legacy of suffering that would affect generations of women. Joanna died in 1555, still imprisoned, still officially deemed insane. Her death, though barely noted in the annals of history, marked the end of a tragic life. She had been erased from the public memory long before her death, dismissed as a madwoman rather than acknowledged as a victim of a system that valued political convenience over human welfare. Joanna of Castile's story, much like that of Maria Anna of Austria, is a heartbreaking example of how political ambition, when placed above personal well-being, can destroy lives. Joanna's fate reflects not just the personal tragedy of one woman, but the tragic consequences of royal inbreeding. Her story is a stark reminder of the dangers of treating women as mere tools in the pursuit of power. and of the lasting impact that these royal decisions had on the health and happiness of those caught in their webs. The tragic label Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, was not just a nickname, it became her identity, one imposed upon her by those who sought to take control of her kingdom. But was Joanna truly mad, or was she a woman driven to the edge by the isolation and betrayal she suffered throughout her life? To understand her story fully, we must examine the circumstances that shaped her emotional and psychological decline, and the political manipulation that stripped her of her agency. When Philip the Handsome, her husband, died unexpectedly in 1506, Joanna's grief turned into an all-consuming obsession. She refused to let go of his body, carrying it with her across Spain in a morbid procession. She opened his coffin frequently, kissing his decomposing corpse, an act that horrified those around her, but, in many ways, spoke to a deeper, more poignant truth. This behavior, often seen as evidence of her insanity, was in fact the desperate action of a woman who had been emotionally abandoned and isolated from meaningful human connection for much of her life. Joanna's love for Philip was intense, but it was also deeply flawed. Philip's infidelity and coldness toward her created a psychological battleground, one where Joanna's need for affection collided with the reality of a marriage that was more about political power than personal connection. Her emotional response to this betrayal, her obsessive love, was seen as a sign of madness. But could it not have been a natural reaction to a marriage built on power rather than affection? The loneliness, the emotional neglect, and the trauma of an arranged marriage led her to an emotional breakdown, one that modern historians increasingly view as a product of deep depression rather than inherent madness. When Philip died suddenly, Joanna's grief transformed into something darker. Her obsession with her dead husband reached horrifying extremes. She insisted on keeping his body, traveling with it from town to town, sleeping beside it, refusing to let him go. This was the behavior that led to her being labeled as mad. Her actions were grotesque, disturbing, and they became the focal point of court gossip. Yet, if we take a step back, we begin to see that this behavior was not simply the ramblings of a mad woman, but a response to profound emotional and psychological distress. Her family had made her a pawn in their political games, and her personal suffering had been ignored for years. It was not just the loss of Philip that drove her to despair. It was also the loss of control over her own life. In a system that valued royal bloodlines above all else, Joanna was never allowed to be an individual. She was raised to be a political tool, a woman whose primary role was to marry well, produce heirs, and uphold the family legacy. Love and personal happiness were luxuries she was never afforded. She was forced into a political marriage, and when it fell apart due to Philip's betrayal, she had nowhere to turn but into herself, her mind fraying under the weight of a lifetime of isolation, loss, and abandonment. The label of madness was convenient for those around her. Joanna's family, particularly her father Ferdinand, used her emotional instability as a way to seize control of her kingdom. Her so-called madness was the perfect excuse to lock her away, to remove her from the political scene, and to rule in her stead. Ferdinand, who had orchestrated much of Joanna's emotional turmoil through his political machinations, was now able to use her insanity as justification for sidelining her, and when her son Charles V ascended to the throne, he continued this manipulation, using the supposed madness of his mother to secure his own power. Joanna was imprisoned for 46 years in a royal convent, isolated from the world and from any meaningful human connection. The conditions of her confinement were harsh. She was kept in dark, cold rooms, deprived of food and hygiene, and subjected to psychological neglect. For years, she was treated as a prisoner rather than a queen, her royal dignity stripped away. The isolation and neglect she suffered only worsened her mental state. The constant confinement, the deprivation, and the psychological torment had a profound impact on her mind, leading her to bouts of what could be described as dissociation and deep despair. But were these signs of madness, or were they the natural consequence of years of mistreatment and emotional trauma? Joanna's supposed madness was not a result of inherent mental illness. It was the product of her circumstances. Locked away for decades, deprived of the ability to fulfill her role as queen and mother, She became a tragic figure, a pawn in a political game that valued her only for her bloodline, not her humanity. Her isolation was further compounded by the medical understanding of the time. There were no attempts to treat her mental health in any meaningful way. Instead, her condition was dismissed, and her isolation continued. The physicians and attendants who cared for her were more concerned with keeping her out of the way than with providing her any meaningful care or emotional support. The court, and later her son Charles, used her mental state as a political tool, justifying her confinement and sidelining her from any role in the governance of Spain. In the end, Joanna's story is a tragic commentary on the way royal women were treated. Their value was measured not by their abilities, intelligence, or desires, but by their ability to serve the political needs of their families. In Joanna's case, her emotional turmoil was not seen as a cry for help, but as an inconvenience to be hidden away. She was locked away in a royal prison where her suffering was ignored and dismissed as madness, while those around her continued to use her as a tool in their pursuit of power. Joanna of Castile died in 1555, still imprisoned, still officially insane. Her life reduced to a tragic footnote in the history of Spain. Her death was barely noted by the public, as she had been erased from the political stage long before. She had become an inconvenient woman, locked away and forgotten, her suffering ignored by those who should have protected her. Joanna's story, much like Maria Anna's, is a reflection of the brutal treatment that royal women endured. They were not allowed to have lives of their own. They were not seen as individuals, but as political instruments, used and discarded at the whims of those who held power. In the case of Joanna, her mental state was used as an excuse to silence her, to remove her from power, and to justify the continued dominance of her male relatives. Her legacy is one of human suffering, of a woman who was denied the agency to live her life on her own terms and who paid the ultimate price for her family's political ambitions. Joanna of Castile's tragedy wasn't confined to her emotional torment, it was compounded by the political exploitation of her mental state. Her so-called madness, conveniently diagnosed by her family, served as the perfect excuse to strip her of any power and consign her to a life of imprisonment. The isolation she endured, as well as the political machinations that led to her confinement, are a stark reminder of how royal women were often treated as pawns in the games of power and control. Following Philip the Handsome's sudden death, Joanna's grief led her to a desperate obsession with his corpse. She refused to allow it to be buried, even going so far as to carry it across Spain with her. She would open the coffin regularly to kiss the decaying body of the man who had, despite his cruelty, been her only source of affection. The behavior was deemed a symptom of her madness, yet it was also a tragic expression of her deep isolation, a result of the cold and emotionally neglectful marriage she had been forced into. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, and later her son Charles V, seized upon Joanna's emotional instability to remove her from the throne. At the time of Philip's death, Joanna was still officially the queen, yet the political situation in Spain was fraught. The powers that be feared that her mental state would hinder their control over the kingdom, so they decided that she must be locked away. Ferdinand, who had long been at odds with his daughter, saw this as an opportunity to further his own political ambitions. Charles V, too, would benefit from her confinement, as he was able to secure his position as the ruler of Spain without the interference of his mother. Joanna's captivity was not a mere removal from the royal court, it was a life sentence to an emotional and physical prison. She was placed in a royal convent, where her confinement was as much a punishment as it was a means of political convenience. For 46 years, Joanna lived in isolation, hidden away from the world she once ruled. The conditions of her imprisonment were harsh and degrading. She was kept in cold, dark rooms, often deprived of food, and subjected to minimal social contact. The royal attendants who were assigned to her reported strange behavior, including weeks without bathing, the tearing of clothes, and episodes of uncontrollable screaming. These were not signs of insanity but of deep psychological and emotional trauma, exacerbated by years of neglect and confinement. Her mental health continued to deteriorate in these conditions, yet the court never acknowledged the true cause of her suffering rather than a product of her inherited mental instability. Her condition was the result of years of emotional abuse, abandonment, and political manipulation. By labeling her mad, they were able to justify her imprisonment and remove her from the political scene entirely. In truth, Joanna was a victim of a system that viewed her only as a vessel for political advantage, a tool to be discarded once she no longer served that purpose. The political exile of Joanna was not merely a personal tragedy, it was indicative of the broader system that treated royal women as expendable pawns in dynastic games. In a world where political alliances were often forged through marriage and the control of royal heirs, women had little agency over their own lives. They were used to secure alliances, produce heirs, and maintain dynastic power, their personal desires and well-being largely irrelevant. Joanna, like many royal women before her, was expected to marry, produce heirs, and fulfill her political duty, yet when her emotional and mental state faltered, she was discarded, locked away in a convent, her authority stripped from her. It is impossible to separate Joanna's emotional and mental state from the environment she was forced to live in. A life of royal privilege meant little when it was overshadowed by a system that demanded unquestioning obedience and submission to political duty. Her confinement wasn't just a physical imprisonment, it was an emotional and psychological imprisonment, one that stripped her of her humanity and condemned her to a life of isolation, marked by the label of madness that had been imposed upon her. Joanna's story is a stark reflection of the ways in which royal women were treated as mere political tools. Their value was determined by their ability to produce heirs, marry for political gain, and perpetuate the family line. Personal happiness, emotional well-being, and mental health were secondary concerns, often ignored or dismissed entirely. When Joanna's mental state was deemed too fragile to rule, her family had no qualms about using her condition to justify her removal from power. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Joanna's exile was the fact that it was never truly about her. Her suffering was used as a political tool to secure the interests of her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V. The political stakes were high, and Joanna was deemed expendable. She was locked away, erased from the political stage, and her mental health issues were framed as a convenient excuse to remove her from the throne. Joanna of Castile lived the final years of her life in captivity, officially labeled insane, but in reality, she was a prisoner of a system that saw her only as a means to an end. Her life, and the lives of many royal women like her, were shaped by a system that placed dynastic survival above individual dignity. When she died in 1555, her passing was largely ignored. She had been out of the public eye for so long that her death was nothing more than a footnote in the history books. Joanna's death was the final act in a life that had been defined by emotional abuse, isolation, and political manipulation. She had been locked away, silenced by the very system that had once called her queen. But her story, though often overlooked in the grand narrative of European history, is one of profound significance. It serves as a reminder of the cruelty that royal women endured throughout history and the ways in which they were used, abused, and discarded in the name of political power. Joanna of Castile's suffering was not just personal, it was a reflection of the broader systemic issues that plagued royal families across Europe. Her story is a tragic example of how women were reduced to their reproductive and dynastic roles, their personal needs and desires often ignored, their suffering dismissed as madness or divine punishment. Her life and death marked the painful cost of a system that valued bloodlines and political power over human dignity and well-being. From the isolated confines of royal palaces to the gilded courts of Spain, the next figure in our tragic tale of inbreeding is Margaret Theresa, daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Maria Anna of Austria. By the time Margaret Theresa was born in 1651, the Habsburgs had long been infamous for their insular marriage practices, and the toll of these practices was becoming undeniable. Margaret Theresa's life would be defined by her family's insistence on preserving royal bloodlines at all costs, a legacy that would leave her physically frail, emotionally isolated, and ultimately doomed. Margaret Theresa's childhood was one of extraordinary isolation, yet it was shrouded in the grandeur and magnificence of the Spanish court. Born into a family with a centuries-old tradition of inbreeding, her birth was just another chapter in a long line of marriages between close relatives. Her father, Philip IV, had married his niece, Maria Anna of Austria, and their union had produced a child that would one day be thrust into the political crossfire of a dynastic struggle. Margaret Theresa's role was never truly hers to define. She was a pawn in the game of dynastic politics. Her future already sealed the moment she was born. In the grand halls of the Spanish court, she was raised not for love, but for duty. Her early years were dominated by the expectations of her family: to maintain the royal bloodline, to marry for political gain, and to produce heirs who would carry on the family's name. From a young age, Margaret Theresa was trained to understand her place within the court's intricate web of political alliances. Her education, which was extensive by the standards of the time, was focused on making her a suitable match for her future husband, her uncle Leopold I of Austria. By the age of just 15, Margaret Theresa was married to Leopold, her uncle, in a union that was celebrated throughout Europe as a diplomatic triumph. Yet, behind the grand celebrations and the lavish ceremonies, the reality of Margaret Theresa's situation was far from ideal. She was a child, barely in her teens, expected to marry a man nearly twice her age and bear children for the continuation of the Habsburg dynasty. Her frail health and young age were already causes for concern, yet the court's demands remained unchanged. The pressure to produce heirs, healthy ones, who would survive infancy, was immense. The survival of the dynasty rested on her ability to bear children, and the toll it took on her body was immediate and catastrophic. In the years following her marriage, Margaret Theresa faced multiple pregnancies, each one a painful trial that left her body weaker and more debilitated. Her first pregnancy, a daughter, ended tragically after only a few months. She was devastated, but the court and her family insisted that she try again, and so she did. But the strain of constant pregnancy, coupled with the physical and emotional toll of inbreeding, soon began to take its toll on her health. Her second pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, and by the time she had delivered a son, the relief felt at court quickly turned to despair. When it became apparent that the child had inherited the full spectrum of Habsburg genetic defects, Margaret Theresa's physical decline was evident to all. But it was masked by the expectations of the court, which continued to demand her to fulfill her role as a breeder of heirs. She was expected to produce healthy children, to secure the dynasty, and to endure the physical demands of her role without complaint. But this was no easy task. Her health continued to deteriorate with each pregnancy. Margaret Theresa's frail constitution was no match for the physical strain, and the ongoing pressure to bear children eventually led to the onset of severe anemia, respiratory issues, and perhaps even epilepsy. She was slowly being consumed by her own body, a body that had been irreparably damaged by the same family bloodline that had been so carefully preserved through generations of inbreeding. Despite the constant physical toll, the court continued to push Margaret Theresa to bear more children. The weight of the dynasty's survival rested on her young shoulders, and it was a weight that was becoming unbearable. The court physicians documented her physical decline with clinical precision, noting her increasing difficulty with speech, her frequent seizures, and her inability to keep food down. Yet, despite their thorough documentation of her ailments, they never once connected these symptoms to the obvious cause: the genetic damage inflicted by her family's obsession with maintaining a pure bloodline. The idea of genetic incompatibility of inbreeding depression was not yet understood, and so the court and the physicians could offer no explanation other than vague and increasingly ineffective remedies. Her eventual death at the age of 21 in 1673 was marked not by mourning for the woman she was, but by the relief that her death would not lead to further complications in the royal line. Officially, her death was attributed to a fever, but the reality was that her body had simply given up under the accumulated weight of genetic defects and the constant physical strain of childbearing. The court mourned her loss, but their grief was for the political ramifications of her death, not for the young woman whose life had been defined by the tragic consequences of royal inbreeding. Margaret Theresa's story is one of unfulfilled potential and unrelenting pressure. She was a woman trapped by the political system that valued bloodline purity above her health and well-being. Her physical and emotional suffering were not seen as tragic in themselves. They were seen as an unfortunate side effect of her role as a vessel for the family's survival. She was expected to bear the weight of her family's legacy, to continue the dynasty at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing her own health, happiness, and, ultimately, her life. Her story is not just one of personal tragedy, it is a reflection of the broader consequences of a royal system that treated women as mere tools in the service of dynastic preservation. Margaret Theresa's body was not her own. It was a body that was manipulated, molded, and ultimately destroyed by the demands of the royal court. She was expected to endure the physical demands of childbearing without question, her personal suffering dismissed as an unfortunate necessity in the pursuit of political power. In the end, she became another tragic casualty in the Habsburg dynasty's pursuit of purity at any cost. The marriage of Margaret Theresa to Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, at the tender age of 15, was an event heralded by Europe's courts as a diplomatic and political triumph. It was, on the surface, the fulfillment of her role as a Habsburg princess igniting royal bloodlines in the name of power. But beneath the formalities of the ceremony, beneath the public celebrations and lavish festivities, lay the grim reality that Margaret Theresa's life and her future were already mapped out in a way that left her with little agency over her own fate. Margaret Theresa's marriage was not one based on love or mutual affection. She was still a child, scarcely more than a girl, married to a man who was more than twice her age, her uncle, Leopold I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. The union, though politically advantageous, was a cruel one, forged not in affection but in the needs of a dynasty obsessed with preserving its bloodline. The marriage took place in 1666, a grand affair meant to symbolize the alliance between the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire. For Leopold, it was a strategic move to secure his claim and ensure a continuation of the Habsburg legacy. However, for Margaret Theresa, this marriage represented the end of her childhood. Before the wedding, she had been prepared to fulfill her duty, to marry, bear heirs, and secure the Habsburg name. From the moment the vows were exchanged, she was expected to produce heirs for the dynasty, and any thought of her own desires or personal happiness was immediately swept aside. The royal court demanded nothing less than her ability to provide a healthy succession, regardless of her health, her age, or her well-being. The expectations placed upon Margaret Theresa were crushing. Her frail health and her young age meant that the pressure to conceive and produce heirs was particularly daunting. She was not simply a bride. She was a breeding vessel for the continuation of the royal line, yet the pressures of her new role were far greater than she could have imagined. She quickly discovered that the demands of her body, the toll of bearing children, would become the most difficult challenge of all. Her first pregnancy, the birth of a daughter, ended in tragedy. The baby lived only a few months before succumbing to illness, another in a long line of failed pregnancies that were the direct result of the genetic flaws brought about by generations of inbreeding. Despite the deep personal loss she felt, the court was not concerned with her grief. The primary concern was the continuation of the dynasty, the securing of heirs. Margaret Theresa's pain was sidelined, overshadowed by the political importance of her childbearing ability. Her second pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, and with each failed pregnancy, the pressure on her grew. The court physicians, who were tasked with monitoring her health, could offer little comfort. They documented her decline with clinical precision, noting the increasing physical strain her body was under. They saw her not as a person, but as a tool, a royal vessel designed to produce heirs. Her physical suffering, her deteriorating health, and her emotional distress were ignored, overshadowed by the demands placed upon her by the court and her family. Despite her frailty, the pressure to produce a healthy male heir was relentless. The entire Habsburg dynasty rested on her ability to give birth to a son who could carry on the family name. This relentless pressure weighed heavily on Margaret Theresa, whose body was already weakened by the toll of the previous pregnancies. Her third pregnancy did result in a son, but the relief that was felt in the court soon turned to concern when it became clear that the child had inherited the same genetic defects that had plagued the Habsburg family for generations. As the years went by, Margaret Theresa's health continued to decline. The combination of inbreeding-related health problems and the physical strain of constant childbearing took a severe toll on her body. She suffered from severe anemia, respiratory difficulties, and what modern physicians would recognize as the early stages of epilepsy. Yet, despite these obvious signs of deterioration, her health was not prioritized. Instead, the focus remained on her ability to continue bearing heirs. The stress, the physical strain, and the emotional toll of childbearing left Margaret Theresa with little energy to focus on anything else. The court physicians, though attentive to her physical symptoms, never made the connection between her health problems and the long-standing effects of inbreeding. They saw her decline as a series of isolated issues, not as a consequence of the systematic genetic damage that had been passed down through the generations. Margaret Theresa was, in many ways, a tragic figure caught between the expectations of the royal court and the limitations of her own body. Her entire life had been mapped out for her before she even came of age. She was not allowed to define her own destiny. Instead, her worth was measured by her ability to produce a healthy male heir. She was expected to endure the physical and emotional toll of childbearing without question or complaint, her suffering dismissed as a necessary sacrifice for the preservation of the Habsburg dynasty. The pressures of royal life, combined with the physical toll of repeated pregnancies, led to Margaret Theresa's early death at the age of 21 in 1673. Her death was a tragic result of the genetic damage caused by generations of inbreeding, compounded by the immense physical strain of her royal duties. Her death certificate listed the cause as fever, but the reality was far more complex. Margaret Theresa's body had simply given up under the weight of genetic defects and the constant demands placed upon her. In the end, Margaret Theresa's life was one of unfulfilled potential, of a woman who was never allowed to live on her own terms. Her legacy is one of tragedies, not just because of the physical toll of her inbreeding, but because her life was defined by a system that saw her not as an individual but as a means to an end. The Habsburg dynasty may have continued, but it did so at the cost of the women who were forced to bear its burden. For Margaret Theresa, as for many royal women, the psychological cost of her duty was perhaps the most crushing weight she had to bear. Born into a system that viewed her not as a person, but as a tool for dynastic survival, Margaret Theresa's life was shaped by expectations and pressures that few could imagine. The cost of bearing heirs, producing children to ensure the survival of the royal line, was immense. But it wasn't just the physical toll that she suffered, it was the emotional and psychological toll that came with being treated as little more than a vessel for the family's legacy. From the moment Margaret Theresa married Leopold I, her role as a royal wife and future mother was set in stone. Her health, her happiness, and her personal desires were secondary to the dynastic needs of the Habsburg family. Her primary purpose was to secure the future of the dynasty, to produce heirs who would carry on the royal name. And for this reason, her worth was measured not by her intellect, her character, or her personal accomplishments, but by her ability to fulfill the most basic of royal duties: to bear children, preferably male heirs. This system, where the lives of royal women were reduced to their reproductive function, was deeply damaging, both physically and mentally. The intense pressure to produce heirs, compounded by the constant threat of miscarriage, infant mortality, and the physical strain of repeated pregnancies, took a profound toll on Margaret Theresa's psyche. In a world where women's worth was tied solely to their ability to bear children, her identity was defined not by who she was, but by what she could produce. With each failed pregnancy, with each miscarriage, Margaret Theresa's sense of self-worth was further eroded. She was constantly reminded that her value was contingent upon her ability to produce healthy heirs, and when her body failed to do so, she was made to feel inadequate. Her suffering, both physical and emotional, was ignored, as the court's focus remained solely on the political necessity of securing a male heir. The personal cost of this dynastic pressure was never acknowledged. Margaret Theresa's mental and emotional well-being was seen as irrelevant, secondary to the greater political goals of the Habsburg family. Her second miscarriage was particularly traumatic. The child she had carried had been another hope for the dynasty, another chance to secure the future of the Habsburg line. But like her first pregnancy, it ended in failure, leaving Margaret Theresa devastated. Yet, rather than offering her comfort or understanding, the court's response was one of impatience. The royal family's primary concern was not her grief, but the need for her to try again, to continue producing heirs, regardless of the toll it took on her body or her mind. The constant physical strain of childbearing left her physically weakened, but the emotional toll was perhaps even greater. The anxiety and depression that accompanied each pregnancy, each loss, were ignored, dismissed as part of the royal duty. For Margaret Theresa, the experience of pregnancy was not one of joy or excitement, but one of fear and dread: fear of miscarriage, fear of bearing a child with genetic defects, and fear of failing to meet the court's expectations. But her emotional suffering did not end with her physical decline. The court's treatment of Margaret Theresa and the royal system she was forced to live within made it clear that her value lay not in her individuality, but in her ability to serve the needs of the Habsburg dynasty. Her identity, her sense of self-worth, was never allowed to develop beyond that of a breeder of heirs. Her life was defined by the demands of the court and by the expectations placed upon her by her family. And in the end, Margaret Theresa's fate was sealed by the very system that had created her suffering. Her death at the age of 21 was not only the loss of a young woman who had been physically worn down by the strain of constant pregnancies, but the loss of a person who had never truly been allowed to live her own life. She was not allowed to define her own identity, to experience life on her own terms. Instead, her existence was bound to the needs of the royal family, and her worth was determined by her ability to bear heirs for the dynasty. The emotional and psychological cost of this duty was immense, and it ultimately led to her early death, her body worn down by the weight of her obligations. Margaret Theresa's story is not just one of physical suffering, it is a story of the psychological toll that comes with being treated as an object rather than a person. Her identity, her worth, were never her own. They were shaped by the expectations of her family, the demands of the court, and the pressures of royal duty. The cost of these pressures was too great for her to bear, and it ultimately led to her early death. Her story is a stark reminder of the ways in which royal women were dehumanized, reduced to their reproductive function, and valued only for their ability to produce heirs. The psychological and emotional cost of this system was immense, and it took a profound toll on women like Margaret Theresa, who were trapped in a cycle of duty, obligation, and suffering. The death of Margaret Theresa at the age of just 21, while deeply mourned, was a tragic culmination of a life spent under the unrelenting pressure of royal expectations. It was not simply the death of a young woman, but the death of a life defined by dynastic survival, where personal happiness and well-being were never a consideration. She was, in many ways, a casualty of the system that had placed her on the throne of royal duty from the very beginning. Margaret Theresa's passing was officially recorded as a fever, but the true cause was much more complex and far more heartbreaking. Her death was the result of years of physical toll, emotional strain, and psychological torment. Her body weakened by the constant strain of repeated pregnancies, her frail health exacerbated by the demands of bearing children for the dynasty, could no longer endure. The pressure to produce heirs, compounded by the repeated miscarriages and the emotional devastation that accompanied each loss, left her with little vitality to fight back against the genetic defects that had plagued the Habsburg family for generations. The Habsburgs, in their relentless pursuit of bloodline purity, had created a legacy that, for many women in the family, led to physical and emotional suffering. Margaret Theresa was no exception. While her death was mourned throughout the court, the true cause of her demise was overlooked. The court's official mourning was more about the loss of potential heirs and the political ramifications of her death, rather than the personal tragedy of a young woman who had been pushed beyond her limits. The royal family and the court viewed Margaret Theresa primarily as a vessel, a bearer of heirs. Her worth, and by extension her legacy, was measured not by her intellect, her personality, or her accomplishments, but by her ability to fulfill her duty to the family. When she died, her loss was felt not for the woman she was, but for the dynasty she had failed to secure. Her death represented not just the end of her life, but but the loss of the potential for a continuation of the Habsburg name, something that the court could never reconcile. The relief felt at court when Margaret Theresa passed away was not for her personal suffering to end, but for the political relief that followed. Her death meant that the succession could continue, and the burden of producing heirs would fall to others in the family. It was a cold, calculating response to her death, one that reflected the dehumanization of the royal system that had placed her under immense pressure in the first place. What makes Margaret Theresa's death so poignant is that she never had the chance to live a life of her own. She was born into a world that saw her not as an individual, but as a tool to preserve a bloodline. Her worth was never defined by her ability to be happy, to love, or to choose her own path, but by her capacity to bear children for the Habsburg dynasty. She was expected to sacrifice her health, her happiness, and her life for the political survival of her family. And in the end, that sacrifice was what led to her premature death. In the annals of royal history, Margaret Theresa is often overshadowed by the larger political events of her time. Her death, though a tragic end to a short life, is a reflection of the systemic issues that plagued royal families for centuries: issues of power, control, and the dehumanization of royal women. These women, including Margaret Theresa, were valued only for their ability to bear heirs, to perpetuate a bloodline, and to serve the political needs of their families. Their lives were defined not by their own desires, but by the needs of the dynasties to which they belonged. Margaret Theresa's legacy is one of profound tragedies, not because of her early death, but because of the system that created it. Her life was defined by the relentless pressures of royal duty, and her death was a consequence of a system that valued power and bloodline, purity over humanity and well-being. Her passing was not a moment of mourning for the woman she could have been, but for the political ramifications that followed. In death, as in life, Margaret Theresa was a tool to further the dynastic goals of the Habsburg family. Her story, though often overshadowed by the grand narratives of royal power, serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of dynastic politics. Margaret Theresa, like so many women before her, was reduced to her reproductive function, her worth measured solely by her ability to produce heirs. Her death marks the tragic end of a life that could have been so much more had the system that defined her not placed such a heavy burden on her shoulders. The death of Margaret Theresa at just 21 was not an isolated tragedy. It was the culmination of generations of systemic abuse, both physical and emotional, within the Habsburg family. Her death, like those of her relatives, was a direct consequence of a royal system that demanded everything from its women's health, vitality, happiness, while giving them little in return. This system, built on centuries of inbreeding, resulted in a slow, inexorable decline that was visible not just in physical deformities, but in the psychological toll it took on every member of the family. The Habsburgs, in their obsessive pursuit of bloodline purity, believed that preserving their royal blood was the key to maintaining their power. They saw marriage as a tool to preserve this purity, disregarding the dangers of inbreeding and the potential harm to their descendants. The result was a family slowly poisoned by the very blood that had once been their symbol of strength. The hallmark of this tragic experiment was the Habsburg jaw, a physical deformity that became emblematic of the genetic damage caused by generations of cousin marriages and incestuous unions. But the Habsburg jaw was not the only deformity passed down through the generations. Mental illness, physical weakness, infertility, and developmental delays were common among the family, exacerbated by the genetic isolation enforced by royal marriages. Women like Maria Anna, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Theresa, and countless others were caught in a web of royal politics, their health and well-being sacrificed in the name of dynastic preservation. They were not seen as individuals with hopes, desires, and dreams. They were seen as vessels for continuing the family line, their value determined solely by their ability to produce heirs and preserve the bloodline. The genetic effects of this inbreeding became undeniable by the late 17th century. As the Habsburgs' physical and mental decline was increasingly apparent, the family's genetic legacy had become so fragile that even their ability to rule was in jeopardy. The once great Habsburg dynasty was now a shadow of its former self, plagued by the very bloodline that had once been their symbol of power. And as each generation passed, the toll of inbreeding became more apparent, leading to a series of tragic deaths and the eventual decline of the Habsburg Empire. In many ways, Margaret Theresa's death symbolizes the final blow to the Habsburg dream of dynastic purity. She was the last of a long line of royal women who had borne the weight of this family obsession, their lives shaped by the same tragic pattern. Her death marked the end of her own suffering, but it also marked the end of a cycle that had been set in motion centuries earlier. Yet the legacy of the Habsburgs, and the lessons learned from their tragic end, did not end with their decline. The Habsburgs' genetic experiment was one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of the dangers of inbreeding and the devastating consequences it can have on human health. The suffering of the Habsburg women, and their inability to escape the constraints of their bloodline, helped to shape the modern understanding of genetics, hereditary diseases, and the importance of genetic diversity. The tragedy of the Habsburgs was not just the story of a royal family's decline, it was a reminder of the consequences of valuing power over humanity. The royal system that placed dynastic survival above the well-being of its members led to a legacy of suffering that lasted for generations. It was a system that dehumanized its women, treating them as tools for political gain, rather than as individuals deserving of autonomy, happiness, and health. That Habsburgs were not just victims of their own genetic legacy. They were victims of a system that valued political power over the human cost of its survival. The women of the Habsburg family, Maria Anna, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Theresa, and others, were forced to endure lives marked by physical deformities, emotional trauma, and the constant pressure to serve the political needs of the dynasty. Their suffering was the price of a system that saw them not as people, but as vessels for preserving power. In the end, this system consumed them, and the Habsburgs, once one of Europe's most powerful families, were reduced to a cautionary tale. Their legacy, however tragic, is one that serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of inbreeding and the importance of genetic diversity. The suffering of the Habsburg women, while horrific in its own right, contributed to the scientific understanding of genetics and the harmful effects of inbreeding. Their pain was not entirely in vain. It provided invaluable insights into the human condition, helping to shape the modern understanding of hereditary diseases and the genetic consequences of family isolation. As we reflect on the lives of the Habsburg women, we must remember that they were not just victims of their family's obsession with bloodline purity. They were real people, with hopes, dreams, and desires, who were forced to live lives that were shaped by forces far beyond their control. Their stories remind us of the dangers of political systems that prioritize power over humanity, and the importance of recognizing the dignity and worth of every individual, regardless of their social status or family background. The legacy of the Habsburgs, both tragic and redemptive, serves as a cautionary tale of what can happen when bloodlines are valued more than the lives of the people who carry them. It is a legacy that highlights the human cost of political ambition and the perils of valuing genetic purity above all else. In the end, the suffering of the Habsburg women serves as a reminder that true nobility lies not in bloodlines, but in the courage to acknowledge our shared humanity.